Good afternoon, everyone, and you're very welcome to our Monday session with the Rotary Club of Kilkenny. Delighted to welcome a former colleague of mine, Sarah Drea, who is Development Manager with the Citizens Information Service in Kilkenny on the parade. I worked with the Citizens Information Board, one floor above Sarah, for almost 20 years. And I'm delighted that she was able to join us today. Sarah, you're from Goran originally. Are you from Goran originally?
Yeah, I'm from about 2 miles outside Goran. I grew up on a farm, Ian, so
Right.
very proud of the agricultural background.
Well, you've more than that. I was talking to a former teacher of yours who some years ago, John Knox, who said that you were the only person in the class that he remembered that could name every member of the Kilkenny hurling team, including the reserves. So
my memory was a lot better a long time ago when I was in primary school.
Well, in your current role, you don't have to rely on your memory, but we'll be asking you to recall some of the things that might have happened over the last number of years. What's your own background? Before you joined Citizens Information, what were you doing before that?
I started my working life actually in Nolan Travel in John Street. I worked there for about 6 months. I was on the panel for the bank at the time. So I spent 6 years in the Bank of Ireland and in the trustee department in Dublin. And then I left the bank and went to study full time. And after I finished my studies, I worked down in Clare with the Leader program. And with Father Harry Bowen was the chief executive at the time. And those were kind of exciting days. It was a baptism of fire after my time in college. And then I worked in Maynooth in the Centre for Adult and Community Education for a short time. And my ambition was always to come back to work in Kilkenny because I really love Kilkenny. And I always wanted to come back to live in Kilkenny. And the job was advertised in Citizens Information, and I was very lucky to get it. And I've been happy there since.
Yes, if I remember rightly, the board at the time faced some challenges because they were appointing someone who wasn't already a volunteer there. But you were based in Desert House at that stage, were you?
Yeah, we were in Desert Hall, yeah. And I think the big challenge was there wasn't enough space for us. I didn't really have an office. So anyone who knew the late John Bulger and who knows Elaine, they accommodated me in their sitting room. So whenever the centre was open, I used to pack my bags and go down to the Bulger sitting room and work away. So that was the start of life in Citizens Information for me.
And I know you moved to the office on the parade in 2001, and it's probably one of the best offices in the country. It's got a lovely facade and a lovely entrance. Has it worked out for you, that move?
Oh yeah, it surely has, Ian. And it's funny, when we moved in first, it wasn't at all what we were expecting because the impression was that you needed to have private interview rooms. And it was, as you know, it's an open plan area. And we really were concerned about how that would work for the public, whether people would actually use the service in that kind of open plan environment. But they did, and it has worked out very, very well for us. We've been very happy there over the years, and the numbers of people using the service, as you know, have just grown steadily over the years. So yeah, it's been a great place for us.
The type of people who call into you or who come to you with queries, I'm sure it covers quite a range of Irish society. And people not originally from Ireland. I always thought that the name Citizens Information was perhaps a little narrow because you're often dealing with people who are not yet citizens or who are not citizens, but they're still members of the public and they're citizens of somewhere, even if they're not citizens of Ireland. What type of queries do you find yourselves dealing with most of all?
Well, I suppose the first point that's relevant, Ian, is that Citizens Information is a service for everybody. whether people are citizens or not is immaterial, and it's also immaterial what their background is or anything, because really we give information about everything under the sun, and at different points in everybody's life different things happen and they need information. So it really is like, there was discussion about targeting the service at different groups and so on. This is a service for everybody. Everyone meets a time in their life when they're vulnerable. Everyone meets a time in their life when they need information. And yeah, we're just there. And in normal times, the doors are open Monday to Friday, and people can walk in and ask anything they want. So,
Yeah.
you know, we don't have all the answers, or we don't claim to have, but it's open to everybody, and it's open about everything.
Yeah, I always remember that it's not so much that you will always have the answer to everything, but you'll be able to point people in the right direction.
Yeah.
If and I know that social welfare is perhaps, because it's so complex, that it comprises the largest cohort of queries. Um, but what's unique about citizens' information, if I have a query on tax, I can go to the Revenue Office, but they're not going to tell me the social welfare implications of that tax query. Whereas the Citizens Information Service can blend all the things together, be it tax, employment law, social welfare, consumer rights, bereavement. All of these things can be brought together to give an individual a comprehensive and a holistic answer to their queries. And that's perhaps what is the unique feature, I think, of citizens' information. But when you look back on how the service has evolved over the years, it started out, if I remember rightly, with Elaine Bulger and a group of people who were concerned that ordinary people didn't know what their rights and entitlements were.
Yeah, the service was initially set up in 1974, following a meeting of the Kilkenny Business and Professional Women's Association. And Elaine was one of the people who was at that meeting. The late Margaret Tynan would have been very instrumental, I think, in convening it. And they set out to make sure that people had information about their rights and entitlements from the state, to help people to help themselves, was kind of their motto. They expected that the bureau, as they called it, would be self-financing, and that it would be staffed entirely by volunteers. And it was staffed entirely by volunteers until 1997. Now it closed for a period and reopened again in 1982 when Fieldcrest closed. So it has been running continuously since 1982. And I was the first person employed in the service. So that was a very interesting transition for everybody involved at the time, and it went very well. So yeah, that's kind of the history of it, Ian.
And you started out with volunteers. How many staff are now employed by Kilkenny CIS?
There's 2 full-time information officers. There's 1 part-time information officer, 1 part-time administrator, and I'm shared with Carlo now. So you've got
But there's a number.
3 full-time equivalents and myself half-time.
Right. But your other half, you're not split in 2. You're working full time, albeit sharing yourself with another county. And you mentioned volunteers. Is the service still dependent on volunteers?
Well, if you'd asked me this question this time last year, I would have said absolutely. Like there's 50 volunteers involved in County Kilkenny who are active in the service, and 40 of those work in the centre in Kilkenny itself. So when you broke that down into whole-time equivalents, you were looking at a roughly 50-50 breakdown between paid staff and volunteers. So yes, now we've come through this year with no volunteers, and we've dealt with about 75% of the number of callers we would have dealt with in the previous year. And we've allocated some staff coverage to a centralised national callback system. So there's a lot of questions, I suppose, raised by the operations that we've been through in the last 12 months. But I would say, yes, certainly we are heavily dependent on volunteers, and they bring a very rich dynamic into the service that I will be looking forward to seeing coming back.
Yes, I know from my own time working with you that Kilkenny was unique in having so many volunteers, all with the same level of commitment and expertise. How did they acquire? I mean, it's one thing to have a willing volunteer. It's another thing to have a knowledgeable, willing volunteer. How do they acquire the same amount of knowledge about the information that they have to give on such a diverse range of topics?
Well, there's a fairly robust training. There's a fairly robust selection process in the first place, Ian. Everyone who applies is interviewed. And we're looking for people who are open to learning and who are, I suppose, not necessarily knowledgeable, but have an inquiring mind and are keen to find out answers. So have an interest in research, I suppose, more so than anything. So once people apply and are interviewed, then they do an 18-week training program. So there's 3 hours per week training. And that's supplemented then by the online training that's provided by the Citizens Information Board. So there's a fairly robust amount of training, and the emphasis of that training is on the general understanding of things like the social welfare system, the tax system, the health services. But the big emphasis really is on where to find information and how to look it up, and then how to interview a person and build the picture of what they need, and find out what their circumstances are, because that'll influence the answers you're going to be giving them. So it's complex. I remember one of the volunteers who joined us about 6 years ago. She had retired from a fairly high-powered civil service job, and she just said, this is very complex. And it is very complex, but we've managed to break it down into enough simple steps to make it possible for people to do it. And then the support of the paid staff within the office environment is very important as well. And I said people need to be open to learning. People need to be open to asking for help. None of us knows all the answers, and we need to be secure and confident in ourselves to ask for help when we need it. And that makes it possible for it to work,
If I walk into the Citizens Information Service and I have a specific query, I can always look up the website, which is very comprehensive, but it doesn't necessarily, I can't find out in that page on the website where it applies to me. It'll give all the answers about social welfare, but how would I find out what affects me and the particular nuances of my situation? Will the Citizens Information Service be able to help me there?
To a certain extent, we will. In a way, you've kind of put your finger on the button as to why we're still relevant. I mean, everyone has information in the palm of their hand now, and 20 years ago, I would have thought we'd be redundant by now, that everyone had everything they needed on their phone or wherever. But we can do a certain amount of applying the information to your circumstances, but ultimately that rests with the deciding officers in either the Department of Social Protection or in the Revenue Commissioners if it's a tax related query. But we've enough insight into the system, and if you tell us enough of your circumstances when we build the picture, we are able to apply it to your circumstances reasonably well. But we would always kind of say to you, you'll know your final answer when you actually maybe go through an application process or whatever it is you're inquiring about.
Mm. Some of the application forms for various state benefits and entitlements are very complex. I know one of the application forms, I think, is 48 pages long. And you cross out, can you or somebody in your office help an individual fill out an application form?
Yeah, that's a big part of what we do. 80% of what we do is provide information, and 20% is we assist people with telephone calls, we assist people with filling forms, we do a small amount of advocacy work where we speak on someone's behalf if they need to appeal a decision. But yeah, certainly a big part of our work, and that's something that has been challenging in the last 12 months because we're doing it over the phone. But a big part of our work is helping people fill in forms.
Mm. And how can you do that over the phone? I mean,
yeah, no,
line by line.
Yeah, it is. It's a case of everyone being patient and taking their time and going at it line by line.
Right.
And the information officers have been creative in how they've adapted. Before we had to close our doors last March, 65% of the people we helped came in and met us face to face, and 35% were dealt with over the phone.
Right.
And over the last 12 months, 80% are now on the phone. 16% were face to face, and that's kind of residual numbers from January and February of last year. And then we've had 4% of our queries are by email. So there's a huge shift in how we do our work. The information officers have been very creative in how they go about helping people fill in forms. They'll do it line by line on the phone with people who are able to do that. And then if somebody is very, maybe has a literacy problem or whatever, they will actually fill in the form and post it out to them for signature. So right. There's ways and means of making things work. It's a bit of a challenge, like doing that then requires us to get data consent from the person before we actually fill in the form, but we've found our way around managing to do that.
Yeah. And do you find that the system works with people or against them? I remember once talking to a community welfare officer who felt that some of their colleagues felt it was their money they were giving out and had a very negative approach to any applicant. Does the system, the social welfare system in particular, work with people or against them, or is it absolutely non-judgmental?
That's that's a difficult question. I tend to take the view that it is objective and that people, people will always eventually get whatever they're entitled to get. Sometimes it's made more difficult if a form isn't filled in correctly on day one. A person might be refused something and then they have to go through trying to get that decision reviewed or appealed. But you tend to hear about the problem cases rather than the numbers that are successfully processed. And if you look at the numbers of people who were put on to the pandemic unemployment payment in a matter of weeks last year, I think that showed a willingness on the part of the state to support people and to be with people. So in my experience, generally, Ian, if people present themselves fairly and accurately, yeah, they generally get what they are entitled to. I don't know. It's hard to generalize, I suppose.
No, I hear what you're saying, but one of the things you mentioned earlier was that you occasionally spot anomalies, and I know that one of the sections of the citizens information cohort, the whole suite of services that they offer. One is in relation to social policy. Could you tell us what social policy is, first of all, and how it applies to the service in Kilkenny?
Well, social policy is the suite of policies that affect citizens of the state. So they're decisions that are made by government departments in relation to various schemes. And the impact that those decisions make then on individuals can sometimes generate problems for individuals. I'm trying to think of an example that's actually in the newspapers in the last couple of days is like there's talk now about the need to introduce a sick pay scheme for employees. And there has never been an entitlement under employment law for people to be paid while they're out sick, paid by their employer when they're out sick. And the absence of that type of sick pay scheme has made it difficult to deal with COVID. People might have had symptoms of COVID but went into work because they weren't going to be paid if they were out of work. And then they spread illness in their workplace. So this would have been something we would flag through our query return system. And Citizens Information Board, who fund us, collate reports based on the individual cases that come through us. And I don't know what exactly has given rise to the decision by government to start to look at the introduction of a sick pay scheme, a limited sick pay scheme, but a sick pay scheme nonetheless. So you'd like to think some of our social policy returns might have contributed to that. I don't know whether that has answered that question now or makes any sense to people.
It's spotting the anomalies within the system, because you're on the ground and dealing with people's queries. Social welfare hears some of the queries, but they don't necessarily hear the conflicts that might arise, say, from somebody getting one entitlement from revenue and another from a conflict one from social welfare, that you're able to spot those and send them up the line and then feed them into government, who may or may not respond eventually.
That's it.
The pandemic has obviously shattered everyone's illusions about how things work in a normal situation. And one of the queries that we've got in from a colleague who's watching us here is the supports for people who are self-employed and small businesses when they have to deal with either revenue or with other issues. Do you have to, it's not just the public, Joe public that you're dealing with, but Joe employer or Joe self-employed?
Oh yeah. We get queries from self-employed people as well as from employees. Now, I have to say the majority of our inquiries tend to come from the employee side of the fence, shall we say, and some of the information that we rely on tends to be written from that perspective as well. But we do provide service to self-employed people. Now, in relation to things like operating the wage subsidy scheme and so on, we're kind of inclined to say to people, have you an accountant to work with you on that? You know, or to try and make contact. Revenue, I'm sure, have their helplines for employers. There's some things that are outside our area of experience, I suppose, but we're willing to try and research information for people, and we're certainly open to doing that.
And if, I mean, I always felt that information is neutral, and if an employee or an employer asks the same question, they will get the same answer, because the truth is the truth. But people will hear different things. They'll hear what applies to them, and they won't necessarily hear it from the other perspective. But moving away from social welfare, you deal with fairly contentious issues as well. Somebody, for example, who might call in who's suffering from domestic abuse or who wants to initiate separation or divorce procedures. Can you advise them on what their rights and entitlements might be?
We can, like, we're a first port of call for everything, Ian. And like when the doors are open to the public, that's one of the challenges of operating the centre. anyone can come in and ask about anything at any time, and you don't get advance notice. So, you know, the people who work with us, both voluntary and paid, need to be robust to cope with what they can be presented with. So we'll say in relation to domestic violence, we can give people information about the legal avenues that are available to them, the legal options that are available. We give them information about the local support services that are available. I'm thinking of the refuge there, and we'll also put them in contact with the Gardaí. So we might not be the place where they will get their final answers, but we are a starting point, and we put people in contact with wherever they need to be put in contact with. Similarly, like separation and divorce is something, you know, and family breakup is we are often the first point of call for people who are quite distressed and emotional. And again, we're able to provide information about the various steps that people need to go through and the various things that need to be addressed, I suppose.
What happens if a husband comes in to ask for how he would follow separation, and you give that person the answer, and the next thing, what appears to be that person's wife comes in asking for information? How do you deal with that sort of conflict or potential conflict?
You don't, you're just giving the information to each person that they've requested, and you don't necessarily join the dots anyway. You won't necessarily know, you won't know that you've dealt with the other half of that couple. Now, when I started working first, we were in Desert Hall, and we had a small room, and the volunteer who was on duty at the time had a lady sitting opposite her who had problems with her employer, and she was in an awful state. And the phone rang at the other side of the room, and I picked up the phone at the other side of the room and realized I was hearing the employer's side of that story. But we were two separate people providing information to two separate people.
Yes.
And you didn't need to break that gap, you know. I don't know if that answers your question, but it does.
It does indeed. And we always have to remember, Kilkenny is still a small town in many ways.
Yeah.
Inevitably. What happens if somebody comes in to the service and you personally know them? How do you, is there a potential there for a difficulty?
Yeah, there is. And in fact, Ian, I suppose just before I answer that specific point, like this is a confidential service, and our duty of confidentiality is to the person who's in front of us. So we would never kind of relate two queries, even if we knew two people were party to the two sides of that coin. When people come in that we know, we always give them the option of dealing with somebody else. Some people take a lot of members of the public kind of don't seem to mind, but we generally try to avoid dealing with people that we know personally. And it's easy enough to do that in the big office because we basically make ourselves scarce when someone we know comes in and another colleague deals with them. So you try to avoid the situation, and then if it does arise, you'd always give the person the choice. But I'm conscious even in giving that choice, people will sometimes agree and say that's grand, whereas it isn't really grand for them. You know what I'm saying? So, we do try to avoid that happening. And the volunteers particularly are excellent at that because you'll just see them making a beeline out of the room, and it's not, they just say hello to the person and they keep going and make themselves scarce. And there's always somebody else there then to deal with the person.
And, you know, in relation to the volunteers, is there a gender divide amongst I envisage, you know, the people who would be free to be a volunteer would generally be perhaps retired or not in full-time employment. Who are volunteers in Kilkenny?
Volunteers in Kilkenny are from every walk of life. We have a reasonably good gender balance, better than in a lot of places. And they're literally, people from all walks of life, people from outside the city, rural people travel in a distance to volunteer, people from the city, everybody. Do you know, it's just a mixed group. I suppose what's the common trend with everyone is they're all interested in people, interested in helping people. They're people who are kind of disciplined in themselves. They don't speak without having done their homework. You know, they're cautious people.
Yes. One of the most high profile aspects of the Citizens Information Service is the Know Your Rights that is published in the Kilkenny People. Are they based on real cases or are they generic?
They're generic and they're generated by the Citizens Information Board who fund us. So they come down from, they're delivered to us centrally and we just put our contact details on them.
And when they appear in the Kilkenny People, do you ever find yourselves getting queries on that specific issue because they've been highlighted and somebody has a specific query in relation to their own case because what's in the paper is too generic?
Yeah, sometimes you do. Yeah, you get a fair bit of response from them. You know, they generate questions and yeah, we do get a bit of that. Yeah, yeah.
When you look back on your time with the Citizens Information Service in Kilkenny, can you remember what your most fulfilling moments were?
Gosh.
Or your most challenging? When you, in other words, if you were to look back and say, you know, I have, if you were talking to somebody in 20 years' time and you look back on this period, what stands out for you? Or what would you remember in your own retirement?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a whole journey of, I mean, the growth of the service is a very public growth and it's there to be seen. But I suppose behind that, I came into the service with a small amount of experience, but I've grown along with the service and my attitudes have changed a lot during the 20 years that I've been working there. And I suppose there's one particular experience I had, which isn't terribly long ago. It's only in the last couple of years. I was helping a lady fill in a form in the office one day. And as I was going through it, it was in the back of my mind. I wasn't demonstrating this now, but I certainly was feeling it. I was saying, why am I doing this with this lady? She seems perfectly capable of doing this herself. And why is she wanting me to be going through the nuts and bolts of her life to put it on this form? But I carried on anyway and did what I needed to do. And when we were finished, this lady just said to me, she said, I really appreciate that help, she said. I left school at 15, and while I can read and write, I'm never 100% sure that I'm understanding what's in front of me. And it really reminded me of why the Citizens Information Centre is there. And, you know, sometimes it isn't the big dramatic things you do, it's the little things that matter so much. And that was kind of it was one of those little light bulb moments, I suppose, if you want, for want of a better word.
Yeah, I can just imagine, you know, you never know why somebody is walking through the door or what burdens they bear and have been putting up with for a long time. Do you think that it takes courage for someone to walk through the doors or to ring up the number to ask for question, to ask for help?
Sometimes it does. You see, this is the thing, Ian, we're all different and we've all had different experiences in our lives and we've all had different maybe happinesses, different hurts. And for some people who come through that door, yes, it's a big deal and we must never forget that. And for others, they're just doing it routinely, you know. So you have to just be aware.
Serial callers. I mean, people who keep calling.
Oh yeah, we do, of course. Yeah, we do.
And as much as anything else.
Any other business now, it'd be return business, we'd be calling that. And and it's good. No, but it's actually something that's very positive. And even when we do surveys of people who use the service to see are they happy, a lot of people have used the service before, and we're happy to see people coming back.
I know that an approach that has been taken by a number of services is a holistic approach. In other words, someone comes in with a specific question, say on social welfare, but they don't know what they're not entitled to and don't ask any question. But the information provider will probe sufficiently to see what else might they be entitled to that they weren't aware of.
Yeah. That's part of what the training that we provide for volunteers and for staff. That's part of the training. And when I talk about building the picture, you're trying to get a sense of the person's circumstances, and in doing that, you're going through a checklist in the back of your mind with other things apply to them. So there's a kind of a formal name for that. It's called a benefits check. And there's a specific way of recording it in our statistics, and we do it. It's done as a matter of course with most people who come in.
If somebody comes in with a patently wrong request, or a request, say an employee comes in and make certain demands on their employer, and you can see that they're not actually entitled to them, how do you break that bad news to them?
You just tell them. You do. Well, you try to put the other person's perspective, and you try to explain the context of why. And that we do actually encounter that type of thing quite a lot, and we encounter we'll have people who will come in and they'll be banging the desk, why didn't I get this from social welfare, or why will my employer not give me 6 weeks holidays, and things like this. And you just have to bring it down a tone and explain the other side of the coin, and explain what is and what isn't okay, we'll say, or what is or isn't within the conditions for whatever it is they're inquiring about. And I think if people feel you're on their side, in the sense of that if they were entitled to it, you'd be telling them they were entitled to it. If they're not, you're just explaining the facts, and most of the time it works out okay.
Can information providers put their own prejudices aside?
I would hope so. It's part of what we're trained to do as well, Ian. And I suppose, when you're dealing with information, you're dealing with facts.
Yes.
I think people do, in fairness. I do think they do.
There's no point in somebody who regards all social welfare applicants as spongers applying then for the job as an information provider, I presume.
Unless they're a very good actor or actress.
Yeah. Do you see you mentioned earlier that you thought at this stage the need for a citizens information service would be redundant. The last year has shown that when people can't come in the door, they'll still find ways of getting through to you. How do you see the future once we get through this pandemic, for example?
It's funny. People have switched very much over to the phones, and they've switched a fair amount onto email, not as big an amount. I think people will still go back to coming in. A lot of people say on the phone, I wish we could come in. And there is that kind of, I think people are missing that face-to-face contact.
Yeah.
So I think it'll, I'm not being delusional about how quickly that'll happen though, Ian, to be honest. I don't know. I suppose that's the big thing about the last 12 months. We've all had to live with not knowing what's happening, and live with a lot of uncertainty, and just be as ready as we can to respond when the circumstances become clearer about what way we will be working.
Well, while the doors may remain closed, at least the service remains open, which can't be said for every service that offers a service to the public. I'm just going to open it up to know if anybody else has any queries that they'd like to put to Sarah. If anybody has anything. I know that one of the people who's with us today is Councillor Martin Brett, who is very heavily involved in dealing with queries from the public as well. But does anyone have any queries that they'd like to put to Sarah?
I have, Ian, if I can.
Yes, Robert.
Yeah, firstly, thank you very much for that. You've spoken a bit about social welfare. Is that the majority of the queries, or if not, could you give me an idea of the commoner issues that people come in with?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked me that, Robert, because it was one of the things I wanted to say. About half of what we deal with is to do with social welfare. And then I had my little table here now. About 10% of what we deal with is to do with employment. And then tax, health, and housing are 6 to 7% each. And then the rest of what we deal with is a little bit of everything else, a little bit of consumer rights, a little bit about family problems, and so on. So that's the situation. And even we'll say in the last 12 months then, those percentages haven't really changed hugely. We have a new category on our recording system just called COVID, and that accounted for 9% of our queries last year. But that took in things like childcare, employment again, the specific social welfare payments that were introduced during the pandemic, the taxation of the pandemic payments, and so on. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm interested that health is relatively low. I would have thought with waiting lists, people would have a lot of health queries. What sort of health issues do you cover?
A lot of what we get asked about really is the qualifying criteria for a medical card, the income limits, and so on. We get a lot of requests for application forms for medical cards. People ask us to help them do the online application. We get asked about hospital charges. That's the main thrust of it, really, Robert. We don't get asked about waiting lists or access to hospitals in that sense. And to be honest, if we were, I'm not sure what answers we'd have for people. Because, I'm not sure even what rules are there, how you move up in the waiting list. I'm really not sure. That's an interesting one now, and it's one that, maybe we might need to give a bit of thought to for the future.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. We did get quite a few questions about the public health measures over the last year, and we got quite a few queries from people who were going back into their workplace and they were concerned about the correct safety measures being in place and that type of thing as well.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions?
Small comment, if you wouldn't mind. Thanks, Dean. Am I muted
yes,
or unmuted?
Oh, we can hear you, Martin.
Okay. Sarah, I'm a big admirer of what you do, but the obvious question for someone who does an awful lot of what you do yourself, what's the hardest case you've ever had to deal with?
I don't tend to think in standouts, Martin, like that, to be honest with you. And I suppose in latter years, I'm not dealing with as many cases directly myself. So I'm not really able to answer. I have had situations where I've had to kind of, we're trained to not show our emotion. And some of the things you get told can be upsetting. And, I have had people in front of me who've maybe been victims of abuse and so on. And yeah, sometimes that's difficult, very difficult. But part of our training is to just not react, to keep focused on the information that we're trying to help the person with.
I'd like to ask just something, the exact opposite of that question, which is, have you ever had a case where you've triumphed, where you've had a real victory, where you didn't expect to have? With somebody coming in with something they weren't sure whether they were entitled to and had been turned down, and eventually you were able to do enough work to be able to get something for them, including perhaps back money.
Yeah, well, the information officers would certainly have lots of those experiences, Ian. And actually, yeah, recently now I had a lady inquiring about a pension entitlement, and I really didn't think she'd get anything, and she did. It would have been a massive amount, but it was a lot more than I thought she was going to get, you know. And yeah, so you would have things like that you'd be delighted for the person.
And why didn't she get it? What happened in that case, if you can remember, that made her not get it initially, but that your intervention ensured that she would? What was the key holding factor?
I think the key intervention was to do with communication, and this wasn't a social welfare pension. It was an occupational pension, and the person hadn't been working in the place she was working for terribly long. So that made me think, you know, this is a bit of a long shot. But she had made approaches herself. It was a very large organization, and she had difficulty tracking down exactly where she needed to contact to find out about her entitlement. So I suppose the difference that we were able to make was that we're used to trying to track down who we need to talk to in the first place. Right. And then we're clear about what information we might need to give them for them to establish whether she had an entitlement or not.
Right.
And I think it was communication and persistence maybe that we brought to it. She didn't have I think she just lost confidence in herself with the inquiry.
Yeah.
And that's what maybe made the difference. In a way, like we have citizen information, but I think we're as much a citizen support centre as anything else. You know, oftentimes we take phone calls and you're wondering, what does this person need to know? And really all they need was someone to listen and, you know, reassure them a little bit, and they were away then to sort out whatever their problem was themselves, you know.
Right. Well, I think, you know, that's a good point to finish on with the two words that you mentioned there, which are critical, I think, to the success of any organization: communication and persistence. And I think that you bring that to the service that you've offered over the decades at this stage, and that I hope that you'll continue to offer for a considerable time to come. I'd like to thank you for the time that you put into talking with us today. And I can only wish you every success as you continue your wonderful work in the future. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thanks very much.
I'd just like to tell members that are still with us, and that next week we will have Alan Haw, who is the, off you go, Sarah, thank you. We'll have Alan Haw, and if you'd like to, if Sarah would like to join us next week, I'll send her an invitation. Alan Haw is the Deputy Chairperson of the Labour Court, and he was involved in writing the Workplace Relations Act for the Department of, well, as it was then, I think the Department of Justice, the Department of Employment Affairs. And Alan will be joining us on Monday next, the 1st of February. On the 22nd of February, we will have Ian Hamilton, who is the person most involved with Sullivan's Brewery, and who has a wonderful perspective on the history of Smithwick's Brewery, where he was master brewer until its closure some years ago. So that's all that we have planned for the next couple of weeks. Just like to tell you that we've closed the I Donate platform at the moment. We've generated 2,250 odd euro, together with donations in cash, which should bring us up to about, I think, now we haven't opened all the envelopes yet that are in the Clubhouse Hotel, but I anticipate that we'll be able to bring it up to well over the 10% of what we raised last year. It's money that is much lower than last year, but but it's money that we wouldn't have raised if we hadn't set up the iDonate platform. So we'll be circulating the details to members in the next couple of days. And I'd particularly like to thank Roisin McQuillan for all the work that she did in setting up and monitoring the iDonate website. Does anyone else have anything to say before we finish? Okay, then I'll see you all next week and look forward to our meeting with Alan Hall. Good luck to you all.